Hello, all. We are doing it. You are doing it. We are almost to the end of the Old Testament. And I just want to say a big congratulations to everybody. Even if you are not as close to the end as maybe our reading schedule suggests, still you are doing it. And I am super proud to be alongside you on this journey. This past week, we finished the book of Jeremiah. We read the book of Ezekiel, and we began the book of Daniel. Now, that is just a few books, right? We only really finished one book. We read parts of two others. And yet, we discovered a lot of prophetic truths in those books. Jeremiah, we closed out Jeremiah as he continued to preach the not so good news of the coming end of the people of Jerusalem. And he continued to fight and be oppressed in the midst of his preaching. Now, the prophet Ezekiel, that is a very different tone, a different tenor than we read in Jeremiah, because Ezekiel is filled with some very interesting visions and prophecies. This is a book of prophecy in the truest sense, in the fact that he has numerous visions, and God gives him different illustrations of the way that God's people are moving away from God's will. And we remember that Ezekiel is preaching to people before the exile, which means before the time that they would lose their beloved city, lose their beloved land, and most importantly, lose their beloved temple. The people would be completely separated from God in the sense that they would no longer be in the city of God. And so Ezekiel preaches a lot to that division. He tries to help people understand that God is with them even in the midst of all this pain, and they must turn back. They must go back to the origins of God's commands, even if it goes so far as to reminding them of the basic laws that God gifted them through Moses. So what is a temple supposed to look like? Who are you supposed to be marrying? And things like that. He's trying to take people back to the basics. And I hope y'all enjoyed Ezekiel. Like I said, it's a very different kind of book than Jeremiah. And then we moved into the book of Daniel. Daniel is half story, half prophecy, right? The first 7 chapters are devoted to the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the furnace for their refusal to worship the king in Babylon. And then the story of Daniel, a beloved servant of the king, a beloved helper of the king, who is also then thrown into the pit of lions. And yet God saves them, right? The king, and wrapped up in ego and social pressure, feels like he must punish these people. And yet God steps in to save them. And not only does God save them, but God calls out to these kings, to these people in power, and reveals God's self to them through his saving of Daniel and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are classic children's stories, but I hope that you can appreciate the way they change when we read them in context, when we understand where they happened and why they happened, and begin to really dig deep into these Sunday school kind of stories. Now, the second part of Daniel, we just kind of dug into that at the end of yesterday and beginning, if you've done your reading for today. Now, that harkens a little bit back to Ezekiel, right? We go back to visions, and these are really deep and entrenched visions. And what's interesting is that God says these visions are about the end, not just about what's happening in the history of the Israelites at that moment, but God says that these are apocalyptic visions. These are talking about the end of everything. And so that is really interesting for us as modern day Christians, as Christians who are reading this thousands of years later. We know that end apparently was not imminent to Daniel or the Israelites. And yet God saw fit to reveal what the end might look like. And what I find interesting in that is that as we read it, we see historical arcs that are always at play, that have been played throughout history. But these are arcs of history that place individuals over groups, right? That place greed over generosity, that place individual selfishness over justice. And we know that is not the arc of humanity that God has placed us on. And so as we continue through Daniel, and we will continue through Daniel, I hope that you'll appreciate what he is trying to teach us and what we can learn even from these really obscure kind of visions. Now, as we look forward, we've spent like a whole week on basically Ezekiel and a little bit of Jeremiah and a little bit of Daniel. Well, coming up this week, you are going to get a huge and quick run through of the rest of the minor prophets. You're going to hit 12 prophets in the next 7 days, and believe it or not, get pretty far into Matthew as well. We are making the transition from the Old to the New Testament this week, just in time for Easter. So happy Easter to all of you. And we are going to hit 12 minor prophets. And the reason we can do that is because most of these books are not more than 10 chapters. Some of them are just a couple of chapters. So you're going to read multiple books a day. Now that's going to be really fast and really difficult to follow. And so what I encourage you to do is, if you're on the Facebook group, find one of our prophetic timelines so you can just have that in front of you as you're reading. If you're following along with the emails, on this email, there'll be an attachment that gives you that timeline. And that's just going to help you kind of put things in context, because they're not necessarily in order of history. And so take time to read through those and do your best before you start any of those books to do just a quick historical recap. Who are we talking to? When are they talking? And what are they trying to talk about? That's all you really need to know, but that'll help you put these words into context. And each of these prophets have a very different kind of voice. They use different kind of catchphrases. They talk in different styles and in different ways. And so they're not going to sound, they'll be repetitive in theme, but they won't necessarily be repetitive in style. And so try to parse out what are some of the differences in the way you're reading those. Now, like I said, at the end of this week, we are going to move into Matthew. We're going to get about 2 days into Matthew as we head toward Easter Sunday. And this is exciting. This is super exciting to move into the New Testament. And one thing I want to say is that if you have found yourself extremely behind, you're worried that you're not going to catch up, if you want, and this is for those of you who are completionists who need to have read every single word of the Bible, then this is not for you. But for those of you who just want to kind of continue the journey, I would encourage you to consider skipping forward and catching up with us in Matthew. You can even start that today or tomorrow if you want to start in Matthew and just start moving through the New Testament. I think that'll give you a chance to still complete an entire testament of the Bible. You can go back and catch up to where you've been in the Old Testament, but also to stay up to date with us as a group. I think that might be really helpful. And so this is your hall pass, your free pass here to get out of class and move forward, move into another space with us if you'd like. Just kind of moving forward with us. And so that's all I have for you guys. I am, like I said, honored to be on this journey with all of you, especially as we head toward Easter Sunday, and we get to explore the life of Christ together coming up. And so enjoy these last few weeks in the prophets, or last few days in the prophets, excuse me, and gear up for the New Testament as we meet God incarnate in Jesus Christ. Blessings, friends.